The sky over Rennick's Hollow turned orange before it turned to fire. Daniel Cole was pulling weeds near his fence when the light in the clouds grew too bright to look at. He shielded his eyes and watched a long streak cut across the sky, breaking into pieces as it fell. The sound came a moment later, a deep rolling boom that shook the loose boards on his barn. Then silence. Then smoke rising from the far end of his fields near the old creek bed. Daniel was not a young man anymore, but he still moved fast when something was wrong. He grabbed a water bucket, more out of habit than sense, and ran across the dirt toward the smoke. His boots kicked up dust with every step. He had lived on this planet his whole life, farming the same stubborn soil his father had farmed, and never once had the sky sent him anything but rain. When he reached the creek bed, he found twisted metal scattered across the ground, some pieces still glowing faintly, others already cooling in the dirt. It was wreckage, clearly from some kind of ship, though nothing like the transport shuttles that sometimes passed overhead. The metal was dark and strange, etched with patterns that did not look like any language he knew. He walked carefully around the debris, keeping his distance from anything still smoking. That was when he saw them. Half buried under a broken piece of hull, nestled in a scorched but oddly intact container, were 3 eggs. They were large, each one about the size of a melon, with hard shells that shimmered faintly, shifting between deep green and near black depending on how the light hit them. Daniel crouched down and stared at them for a long moment. They should have been destroyed in the crash. Everything around them had been torn apart, yet the eggs sat untouched, almost protected, as if the ship itself had shielded them at the very end. He reached out and touched one. It was warm, warmer than it should have been sitting in open air. He pulled his hand back, half expecting something bad to happen, but nothing did. The egg simply sat there, radiating a soft heat, like a small fire kept low and steady inside. Daniel was not a foolish man. He knew he should report the wreckage to the regional office. There was a small outpost 2 days' ride from his farm, staffed by a handful of officials who handled matters like this. But something about the eggs made him hesitate. Maybe it was the way they had survived when nothing else had. Maybe it was simply that he had spent too many years alone on this farm, with only the wind and his crops for company, and something in him did not want to hand this discovery over to strangers who would only see it as salvage. He wrapped the eggs carefully in his jacket and carried them back to the farmhouse. The next morning he did report the wreck, as required by law. 2 officials came out from the outpost, walked the length of the debris field, took notes, and loaded a few pieces of metal onto a cart. They asked him if he had found anything else. Daniel said no. He was not sure why he lied, only that it felt like the right thing to do in that moment. The officials seemed uninterested anyway, calling it minor salvage from an unregistered transport, likely smuggling goods that had gone down during an illegal run through the border systems. They left without much more thought about it. Daniel kept the eggs near the hearth, wrapped in old blankets, checking on them every few hours like a man checking on a fever. Days passed, then a full week. He began to wonder if they were even alive at all, or if he was simply keeping 3 cooling stones warm out of stubbornness. Then, on the 9th night, he heard the first crack. He was sitting by the fire, mending a torn shirt, when a sharp sound broke the quiet. He turned to see a thin line splitting across the surface of the largest egg. He set his sewing aside and knelt beside it, watching as the crack spread slowly, then faster, until small pieces of shell began to fall away. A tiny clawed foot pushed through the gap, followed by a narrow snout, and finally a pair of eyes that opened and looked directly at him. Daniel did not move. He barely breathed. The creature that pulled itself free of the shell was small, wet, and trembling, with folded wings pressed tight against its body and scales that caught the firelight like polished stone. It made a soft sound, somewhere between a chirp and a growl, and crawled toward him without hesitation, pressing its head against his hand. He did not know what it was. He did not know where it had come from, or what it would grow into, or what kind of trouble it might bring to his quiet life. But as the second egg began to crack, and then the third, Daniel Cole understood one simple thing with complete certainty. Whatever these creatures were, they were his now, and he would raise them as if they were his own. Outside, the wind moved gently through the fields, carrying the smell of smoke that still lingered from the crash. Inside, by the fire, three small lives took their first breaths in a world that did not yet know what they truly were. 5 years is a long time to watch something grow, and Daniel Cole had watched every single day of it. The three hatchlings he had pulled from the eggs were no longer small enough to sleep in a basket by the fire. They had grown into creatures the size of large dogs, then the size of horses, and their wings, once folded tight and useless, now stretched wide enough to cast shadows across the whole yard when they stood in the sun. Daniel had given them names early on, back when they were still small enough to fit in his arms. The eldest, bold and quick to act, he called Sable, for the way her scales darkened to near black along her spine. The middle one, careful and watchful, always thinking before moving, he called Rook. And the smallest, the one who never left Daniel's side if she could help it, he called Wren. They were not like any animals Daniel had ever raised. They understood him in ways that went beyond simple training. When he spoke to them, they tilted their heads and seemed to actually listen, working out the meaning behind his words rather than just reacting to tone. Sable learned to open the barn door within a week of trying. Rook figured out how to move rocks to dam the creek when it threatened to flood the lower field. Wren, though smallest, could sense storms hours before they arrived, growing restless and pressing close to Daniel until he brought the animals in and secured the shutters. Daniel taught them the only way he knew how, the same way his father had taught him. He showed them how to hunt in the tall grass beyond the farm, patient and quiet, waiting for the right moment. He showed them how to be gentle with the smaller farm animals, even though their claws could have torn through fencing without effort. He showed them, most of all, how to trust him, and in turn, how he trusted them completely. Word spread slowly through the region that Daniel Cole had three strange, large creatures living on his farm. Most people who heard the stories assumed exaggeration, the kind of tale that grows taller with every retelling. A few curious travelers passed through, asking polite questions, and Daniel gave polite, vague answers. He had learned early on that the less he said, the less trouble followed. But not everyone who came asking questions was simply curious. One afternoon, a pair of men in official-looking grey coats stopped at the farm, claiming to be surveyors mapping unregistered wildlife in the region. They asked pointed questions about the wreck years ago, about anything unusual Daniel might have found. Daniel kept his answers short. Sable, Rook, and Wren stayed hidden in the back pasture that day, as if they somehow sensed the visit was not one to be trusted. The men left without pushing further, but Daniel noticed the way they glanced toward the tree line before they got back in their transport, and he did not like the look in their eyes. That night he sat the three of them down, though of course they could not fully understand every word, and told them plainly that they needed to be careful. Something about the world beyond the farm was not safe for creatures like them. Rook, always the thoughtful one, pressed close to him afterward, resting her heavy head against his shoulder, as if trying to tell him she understood more than he realized. The real turning point came on a night in late autumn when a wildfire swept down from the dry hills to the north, faster than anyone expected. Daniel woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of frightened animals in the barn. The fire had already reached the edge of his fields, moving with terrifying speed through the dry grass, threatening the barn, the house, and everything he had built. He ran for the animals, trying to lead them to safety, but the smoke was thick and the heat was rising fast. It was Sable who acted first. She let out a sound unlike anything Daniel had heard from her before, a deep, resonating call that seemed to shake the air itself. Then she moved between the fire and the barn, spreading her wings wide, and Daniel watched in stunned silence as a gust of wind, far too strong and far too controlled to be natural, rolled off her wing beats and pushed the flames backward, buying precious time. Rook worked fast alongside her, tearing at the dry brush near the fence line, creating a gap the fire could not easily cross. Wren stayed close to Daniel, getting the frightened farm animals out of the barn one by one, nudging them gently but firmly toward the open field, where the ground was already burned clear and safe. By the time the fire finally died down, exhausted against the firebreak they had made, Daniel stood in the smoky dawn light staring at his three grown children with a mixture of relief and something else entirely. Or fear, not of them, but for them. He had always known they were different. Now he understood they were something far beyond what he had ever imagined, something with power that could not stay hidden on a small farm forever. Sable turned to look at him through the fading smoke, her eyes calm despite everything, and in that look Daniel felt certain of one thing. Whatever they truly were, the world outside his fence line would not be able to ignore them for much longer. 3 transports landed in Daniel Cole's field on a grey morning in early winter, crushing his fence line and startling every animal on the property. Daniel was in the barn when he heard the engines and felt the ground shake under his boots. He stepped outside to see armed men spreading out across his land, moving with the kind of practiced order that only came from military training. At the front of the group stood a tall man in a dark coat, clean and pressed despite the mud, who introduced himself as Director Halvorsen. He explained, in a voice that sounded rehearsed, that reports had reached the regional authority of unregistered life forms of significant value living on Daniel's property. He said it politely, almost gently, but there was nothing gentle about the row of armed men standing behind him. Daniel felt his chest tighten. He glanced toward the back pasture, where Sable, Rook, and Wren had been resting in the pale morning light. They were already awake, already alert, watching the strangers with narrowed eyes and low, rumbling growls building in their throats. Halvorsen asked Daniel to bring the creatures forward peacefully for what he called proper evaluation. Daniel refused. He told the director plainly that the 3 of them were not property to be evaluated or seized, that he had raised them since they were eggs, and that no one was taking them anywhere. Halvorsen's expression did not change, but he gave a small nod to the men behind him, and several of them began moving toward the pasture with restraints in hand. That was when Sable stood to her full height. She had grown enormous over the past year, taller than the barn roof when she rose on her hind legs, her wings spreading out to block the pale morning sun. The armed men stopped in their tracks, several of them stepping back instinctively. Sable did not attack. She simply stood between the men and Daniel, between the men and her siblings, a wall of dark scale and quiet fury, and let out a sound that rattled the windows of the farmhouse. Halvorsen took a step back himself, though he tried to hide it by adjusting his coat. He ordered his men to hold position, and for a long, tense moment, nobody moved. Daniel stood his ground beside Sable, one hand resting on her foreleg, feeling the tension coiled beneath her scales. It was one of Halvorsen's own scientists who broke the silence, rushing forward with a small handheld scanner, running it toward Sable despite the obvious danger. The device beeped rapidly, and the scientist's face went pale as he read the results aloud. The scans matched an ancient registry entry, a species listed as critically endangered, believed extinct for generations, the Scytherin. Legendary among the older spacefaring civilizations, known across old records as guardians, warriors, and, in some forgotten stories, protectors of entire star systems. Halvorsen's entire posture changed the moment the word left the scientist's mouth. His polite, rehearsed tone dropped away, replaced by something sharper, more calculating. He began speaking of the tremendous scientific and strategic value such a discovery represented, of how vital it was for these creatures to come under proper government protection immediately. Daniel understood then that this was no longer a conversation. Halvorsen was not going to leave without something, and Daniel doubted very much that anything he said would change that. Rook moved first this time, stepping up beside Sable, followed by Wren, who pressed close against Daniel's side. The 3 of them exchanged a look between themselves, something Daniel had seen 100 times growing up, a silent understanding passed between siblings who had never needed words. He realized, with a sinking feeling, what they were about to decide. Sable lowered her head toward Daniel, her large eyes meeting his, and for the first time since she had hatched, he understood without any doubt that she was trying to tell him something important. She was telling him goodbye. Before Halvorsen's men could react, all 3 of them launched into the sky at once, wings beating hard against the cold winter air, kicking up dust and loose straw across the entire yard. Daniel called out after them, his voice breaking, but the sound was lost beneath the roar of their wings. Halvorsen shouted orders, but it was already too late. Within moments, the 3 shapes had vanished into the grey clouds overhead, leaving nothing behind but silence and the wreckage of a broken fence. Daniel stood alone in his yard, staring up at the empty sky, while Halvorson's men lowered their weapons, unsure of what to do next. The director turned to Daniel with a cold, calculating stare, muttering something about how this changed nothing, that they would find them eventually. Daniel did not answer him. He simply looked back up at the sky, where his children had disappeared, and felt something break quietly inside his chest. He did not know if they would ever return. He did not know what dangers awaited them out among the stars, dangers that a lifetime spent on a quiet farm had never prepared him to imagine. But somewhere deep down, beneath the grief and the fear, Daniel held onto one small, stubborn hope. He had raised them to be brave. He had raised them to protect what they loved. And as he watched the empty grey sky, he found himself believing, against all reason, that this would not be the last time he saw them. The stars looked nothing like Wren had imagined when she was small enough to sleep curled against Daniel's side by the fire. Out here, beyond the pale blue sky of the only home she had ever known, the darkness stretched endlessly, broken only by distant points of light and the occasional flash of a passing ship. She stayed close to Sable and Rook as they flew, though of course there was no true flying in open space, only the strange gliding motion their bodies seemed to know instinctively once they crossed beyond the atmosphere, as if something ancient in their blood remembered how to move even here. They had left Daniel behind 3 days ago, and the ache of that had not faded. Sable had insisted it was necessary, that staying would only put him in greater danger, that Halvorsen and men like him would not stop hunting until they had what they wanted. Rook had agreed reluctantly. Wren had said nothing at all, simply flown alongside them in silence, her chest tight with a grief she did not fully know how to express. Their first encounter with another species came sooner than expected. A small trading vessel, crewed by a group of insectoid beings with segmented grey shells and clicking voices, crossed their path near a quiet asteroid field. The moment the crew spotted the three of them drifting nearby, the entire vessel went still. One of the crew members, older than the rest judging by the pale markings across its shell, emerged slowly and made a strange gesture with its forelimbs, something between a bow and a salute. The being spoke through a translator device, its voice mechanical but full of clear emotion. It called them Scytherin, spoke the word with something close to reverence, and asked, almost fearfully, if the stories were true, if the Guardians had truly returned after so many generations of silence. Sable did not fully understand what the creature meant, not yet, but she answered as honestly as she could. She told them yes, they were Scytherin, though they knew little of what that truly meant beyond the name itself. The insectoid trader seemed almost overwhelmed, quickly offering supplies, directions, anything the three of them needed, refusing any form of payment. It was from traders like this one, and others they met in the following weeks, that the siblings pieced together fragments of their own history. The Scytherin had once been spread across dozens of star systems, revered as protectors, feared as warriors, respected by nearly every civilization that had encountered them. Then, generations ago, something had happened, some great conflict or plague that the records remained vague about, and the Scytherin had all but vanished, their numbers dwindling until most believed the species extinct entirely. Rook, always the thinker among them, began piecing together star charts and old trade routes, following rumors of a hidden Scytherin enclave rumored to exist somewhere near the Outer Rim, a place where the last survivors of their kind were said to still live in quiet isolation. They found it nearly a month later, hidden within the ring system of a quiet, unremarkable planet that no major star charts even bothered naming. The enclave was smaller than Rook had expected, a scattering of stone structures built into the rings themselves, home to perhaps 24 Scytherin, old and weathered, their scales pale with age. The elder who greeted them called herself Matron Io, and her reaction upon seeing the three siblings was unlike anything Wren had expected. The old dragon stood frozen for a long moment, staring at them with wide, disbelieving eyes, before finally speaking in a voice heavy with emotion. She told them that hatchlings had not been born to their kind in generations, that the eggs sent out in the old days as a final desperate act to preserve their bloodline had all been presumed lost or destroyed. When Sable explained, carefully and honestly, how they had survived, how a single human farmer had found their eggs in the wreckage and raised them as his own, the reaction among the gathered elders was immediate and sharp. Several of them reacted with open suspicion, even anger, insisting that no outsider, especially not a human, could be trusted with something so precious as Scytherin hatchlings. But Wren, small and quiet as always, finally found her voice. She told them about Daniel. She told them about the fire he had waded into for them, about the way he had defended them without hesitation against armed soldiers, about years of patient teaching and quiet love that had asked for nothing in return. She told them that whatever the old stories said about humans, one human had proven himself entirely different, entirely worthy of trust. Matron Io listened to every word in silence, her old eyes studying Wren carefully. When the young dragon finished speaking, the elder was quiet for a long moment before finally speaking again, her voice softer now, thoughtful rather than suspicious. She admitted that perhaps their kind had clung too tightly to old fears for too long, that perhaps it was time the Scytherin looked at the wider galaxy with new eyes. Far away, on a quiet farm surrounded by empty fields and a broken fence line, Daniel Cole sat alone by his fire each night, staring up at the same stars his children now called home, holding on to a hope he could not quite explain, unaware that far across the galaxy, his name was already becoming something close to legend among a species that had once believed itself entirely alone. News traveled fast once the trading routes picked up the story, and by the time it reached the human border fleet, the tale had grown into something close to myth. 3 Scytherin, last of an ancient and powerful bloodline, alive and grown, raised in secret by a lone human farmer on a backwater world. Captain Reyes heard the story second-hand from a merchant crew passing through his patrol sector, and at first he dismissed it as exaggeration, the kind of wild tale traders liked to spread to make their roots sound more exciting than they were. That changed the day he received direct orders from the regional command to prepare an escort detail for a Scytherin delegation requesting safe passage to a planet called Renix Hollow. Reyes had served in the border fleet for over 15 years, and in all that time, he had never once been asked to escort a species most scholars considered extinct. He studied the old records during the journey out, reading everything available about the Scytherin, about their history as guardians and warriors, about the strange, sudden silence that had fallen over their kind generations ago. The more he read, the more uneasy he felt about the report Director Halvorsen had quietly filed years earlier, a report that painted the whole matter as a simple resource acquisition opportunity. Meanwhile, far ahead of Reyes' fleet, Sable, Rook, and Wren traveled home at last, escorted by a small group of elder Scytherin led personally by Matron Io. The old dragon had insisted on coming herself, curious to see with her own eyes the human the young hatchlings spoke of with such open affection. Word of their approach spread quickly through official channels, and not everyone who heard the news reacted with simple curiosity. Director Halvorsen, still stationed at the regional outpost near Renix Hollow, saw the approaching delegation as one final opportunity. He had spent years quietly building a case, gathering resources, positioning himself to claim credit and control over whatever remained of the Scytherin situation. When reports confirmed the delegation's destination, he mobilized every asset available to him, determined to secure some form of leverage before Captain Reyes and the official fleet arrived to oversee matters properly. By the time the Scytherin delegation entered orbit above Renix Hollow, Halvorsen had already stationed armed personnel around Daniel's farm once again, this time with heavier equipment and a larger force than before. He stood at the edge of the property, watching the sky, confident that whatever emerged from orbit, he would find some way to turn the situation to his advantage. What emerged from orbit was far beyond anything Halvorsen had prepared for. Sable led the descent, her wings spread wide as she broke through the atmosphere, followed closely by Rook and Wren, and behind them, a formation of elder Scytherin whose combined presence alone was enough to make the ground crew fall utterly silent. Matron Io landed last, her ancient scales catching the afternoon light, radiating an authority that needed no words to command respect. Halvorsen stepped forward, attempting to assert control over the situation, speaking loudly about proper procedure and official jurisdiction. Matron Io turned her gaze on him slowly, and the sheer weight of her attention alone seemed to steal the confidence right out of his voice. She informed him plainly, without raising her voice, that the days of humans attempting to claim ownership over Scytherin lives had ended the moment 3 hatchlings proved to the entire galaxy what humanity was truly capable of, both its worst and its best. Halvorsen tried once more to argue his authority, gesturing toward his armed men, but it was at that exact moment that Captain Reyes' fleet arrived in orbit, broadcasting official clearance codes that overrode Halvorsen's regional authority entirely. Reyes himself descended shortly after in a smaller shuttle, stepping out onto the farm with a calm, measured presence that stood in sharp contrast to Halvorsen's growing panic. Reyes had read every file, every old report, and he had seen enough during his approach to understand exactly what kind of man Halvorsen truly was. He informed the director plainly, in front of both his own soldiers and the assembled Scytherin, that his conduct years earlier had already been flagged for review by higher command, and that any further attempt to interfere with the situation would result in immediate removal from duty. Halvorsen's men lowered their weapons without needing to be told twice, sensing clearly which way the situation had turned. The director himself stood frozen for a long moment, humiliated in front of soldiers, farmers, and beings from across the stars, before finally stepping back and allowing the moment to unfold without him. Through it all, Daniel Cole stood quietly near the farmhouse, watching the sky he had stared up at every night for months, hardly able to believe what he was seeing. When Sable finally turned toward him, lowering her great head until it rested gently against his shoulder, exactly as she had done as a hatchling curling against his side by the fire, Daniel felt every ounce of fear and grief he had carried finally break loose, replaced by something warm and overwhelming. Rook and Wren followed close behind, pressing close around him, and for a long moment, none of them needed words at all. The farm that had once felt so empty was suddenly full again, and the sky above Rennick's Hollow, once just an ordinary stretch of blue, now held the quiet promise of something far greater than anyone they had ever imagined. Rennick's Hollow had never seen so many ships in its sky before, and it was doubtful it ever would again. Word of what had happened on Daniel Cole's farm spread across the settled systems within days, carried by traders, soldiers, and curious travelers who wanted to see for themselves whether the stories were true. Within weeks, official envoys from a dozen different worlds had requested permission to visit, each one eager to witness what many were already calling one of the most important moments in generations, the return of the Scytherin and the strange, quiet man who had raised them. Matron Io remained on the farm during those first weeks, watching everything with careful, patient eyes. She spent long hours speaking with Daniel, asking him questions about how he had cared for the hatchlings, what he had taught them, how he had known to trust creatures he did not understand. Daniel answered honestly each time, admitting he had not known much of anything at first, only that something small and helpless had needed protecting, and that had always been enough reason for him. The old dragon seemed to turn this answer over in her mind many times over those weeks, as if searching for some deeper strategy hidden within it, before finally accepting that there was none. Daniel had simply done what felt right, without calculation, without fear of what the creatures might become. It was, Matron Io admitted quietly one evening, exactly the kind of simple, unconditional kindness her own people had lost sight of during their long isolation from the wider galaxy. The formal ceremony took place a month later, held not in some grand capital or official hall, but right there on Daniel's own land, at his quiet insistence. Representatives from across known space gathered in the open field beyond the farmhouse, standing alongside soldiers, traders, and curious locals from the nearby settlements who had never imagined their small corner of the galaxy would host such an event. Matron Io stood before the gathered crowd, with Sable, Rook, and Wren positioned beside her, and delivered words that would be repeated and recorded across countless star systems in the days that followed. She spoke of the Scytherins' long history as guardians and protectors, of their painful near extinction, and of the quiet miracle that had allowed 3 hatchlings to survive against impossible odds. She spoke, too, of the deep suspicion her people had long held toward other species, a suspicion born from old wounds and older fears. Then she turned to Daniel, standing awkwardly at the edge of the gathering in his plain farm clothes, clearly uncomfortable with all the attention focused on him, and declared before the entire assembled crowd that he was to be recognized as an honorary guardian of the Scytherin people, a title that had not been given to an outsider in longer than even the oldest records could recall. Crowd's reaction was immediate and overwhelming, applause and cheers rising from every gathered species, though Daniel himself simply stood there, shifting uncomfortably, clearly far more used to quiet mornings in his fields than public praise in front of crowds. Sable nudged him forward gently with her snout, and Rook let out something that sounded almost like a laugh, low and rumbling, while Wren pressed close against his side exactly as she had done since she was small enough to fit in his arms. In the weeks and months that followed, life on Rennick's Hollow changed in ways nobody could have predicted. What had once been a forgotten, quiet farming world became a place of genuine significance, visited regularly by travelers eager to see where the legendary Scytherin had returned. Yet despite all the attention, despite the sudden importance placed on his small patch of land, Daniel Cole remained largely unchanged. He still woke early to tend his fields. He still mended his own fences, though admittedly with a little extra help, now from 3 enormous, occasionally overeager companions, who sometimes did more damage helping than the original problem itself. Director Halvorsen, stripped of his position following an official review of his conduct, quietly disappeared from local affairs altogether, a small and forgettable footnote in a much larger story. Captain Reyes, on the other hand, remained a welcome visitor to the farm for years afterward, having earned genuine respect from both Daniel and the Scytherin delegation for his fair conduct during those tense early days. As for Sable, Rook, and Wren, they chose, in the end, not to remain permanently with the small enclave near the outer rim, nor to establish themselves among the grand halls now being built in their honor across various worlds. Instead, they chose to stay close to the quiet farm where they had first opened their eyes by a warm fire, returning often, sometimes for weeks at a time, simply to rest beside the man who had raised them. On clear evenings, long after the crowds and envoys had gone home, and the excitement of galactic attention had settled into a comfortable, familiar rhythm, Daniel Cole could often be found sitting outside his farmhouse exactly as he always had, watching the sky. The only difference now was that some nights, 3 enormous shapes would settle quietly into the field beside him, wings folding down as they lay in the grass, content simply to be near him. The galaxy, for its part, would remember them as legends, as guardians returned from the edge of extinction, as a symbol of what trust between different worlds could truly accomplish. But out there in that quiet field, beneath the same wide-open sky that had watched over 3 eggs hatching by a small fire years before, they were simply, and always would be, his children come home.